Punishments, Rewards, and Expropriation. Excerpted from Time on the Cross, The Economics of American Negro Slavery, by Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman. The exploitative nature of slavery is most apparent in its system of punishments and rewards. Whipping was probably the most common punishment meted out against errant slaves. Other forms of punishment included the deprivation of various privileges, such as visits to town, confinement in stocks, incarceration, sale, branding, and the death penalty. Whipping could be either a mild or a severe punishment, depending on how it was administered. Some whippings were so severe that they resulted in death. Indeed, in cases such as murder, the sentences of slaves who would otherwise have been executed were frequently converted to severe whipping, coupled with exportation to another state or a foreign country. For, as indicated in Chapter 2, by converting the death penalty to whipping and exportation, the state could recover a substantial part of the value of the slave that would have been lost through his execution. In other instances, whipping was as mildly applied as the corporal punishment normally practiced within families today. Reliable data on the frequency of whipping is extremely sparse. The only systematic record of whipping now available for an extended period comes from the diary of Bennett Barrow, a Louisiana planter who believed that to spare the rod was to spoil the slave. His plantation numbered about 200 slaves, of whom about 120 were in the labor force. The record shows that over the course of 2 years, a total of 160 whippings were administered, an average of 0.7 whippings per hand per year. About half the hands were not whipped at all during the period. There was nothing exceptional about the use of whipping to enforce discipline among slaves until the beginning of the 19th century. It must be remembered that through the centuries, whipping was considered a fully acceptable form of punishment, not merely for criminals but also for honest men or women who in some way shirked their duties. Whipping of wives, for example, was even sanctified in some versions of the Scripture. The Matthew's Bible, which preceded the King James Version, told the husband in a note at 1 Peter 3 that if his wife was not obedient and helpful unto him, endeavoreth to beat the fear of God into her head, and that thereby she may be compelled to learn her duty and do it. During the 17th and most of the 18th centuries, whipping was commonly employed as the punishment in the North as well as in the South. Nor until the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century did whipping rapidly fall from favor in the free states. To attribute the continuation of whipping in the South to the maliciousness of masters is naive. Although some masters were brutal, even sadistic, most were not. The overwhelming majority of the ex-slaves in the WPA narratives who expressed themselves on the issue reported that their masters were good men. Such men worried about the proper role of whipping in a system of punishment and rewards. Some excluded it altogether. Most accepted it, but recognized that to be effective, whipping had to be used with restraint and in a coolly calculated manner. Weston, for example, admonished his overseer not to impose punishment of any sort until 24 hours after the offense had been discovered. William J. Minor, a sugar planter, instructed his managers not to cut the skin when punishing, nor punish in a passion. Many planters forbade the whipping of slaves except by them or in their presence. Others limited the number of lashes that could be administered without their permission. The decline of whipping as an instrument of labor discipline outside of the South appears to have been heavily influenced by economic considerations. With the rise of capitalism, impersonal and indirect sanctions were increasingly substituted for direct personal ones. The hiring of free workers in the marketplace provided managers of labor with a powerful new disciplinary weapon. Workers who were lazy, indifferent, or who otherwise shirked their duties could be fired, left to starve beyond the eyesight or expense of the employer. Interestingly enough, denial of food was rarely used to enforce discipline on slaves, for the illness and lethargy caused by malnutrition reduced the capacity of the slave to labor in the fields. Planters preferred whipping to incarceration because the lash did not generally lead to an extended loss of the slave's labor time. In other words, whipping persisted in the South because the cost of substituting hunger and incarceration for the lash was greater for the slave owner than for the Northern employer of free labor. When the laborer owns his own human capital, forms of punishment which impair or diminish the value of that capital are borne exclusively by him. Under slavery, the master desired forms of punishment which, while they imposed costs on the slave, did so with minimum impairment to the human capital which the master owned. Whipping generally fulfilled these conditions. While whipping was an integral part of the system of punishment and rewards, it was not the totality of the system. What planters wanted was not sullen and discontented slaves who did just enough to keep from getting whipped. They wanted devoted, hard-working, responsible slaves who identify their fortunes with the fortunes of their masters. Planters sought to imbue slaves with a Protestant work ethic and to transform that ethic from a state of mind into a high level of production. "My Negroes have their name up in the neighborhood," wrote Bennett Barrow, "for making more than anyone else, and they think whatever they do is better than everybody else." Such an attitude could not be beaten into slaves. It had to be elicited. Much of the managerial attention of planters was focused on the problem of motivating their hands. To achieve the desired response, they developed a wide-ranging system of rewards. Some rewards were directed towards improving short-run performance. Included in this category were prizes for the individual or the gang with the best picking record on a given day or during a given week. The prizes were such items as clothing, tobacco, and whiskey. Sometimes the prize was cash. Good immediate performance was also rewarded with unscheduled holidays or with trips to town on weekends. When slaves worked at times normally set aside for rest, they received extra pay, usually in cash and at the rate prevailing in the region for hired labor. Slaves who were performing well were permitted to work on their own account after normal hours at such tasks as making shingles or weaving baskets, articles which they could sell either to their masters or to farmers in the neighborhood. Some rewards were directed at influencing behavior over periods of intermediate duration. The rewards in this category were usually paid at the end of the year. Year-end bonuses, given either in goods or cash, were frequently quite substantial. Bennett Barrow, for example, distributed gifts averaging between $15 and $20 per slave family in both 1839 and in 1840. The amounts received by particular slaves were proportional to their performance. It should be noted that $20 was about a fifth of national per capita income in 1840. A bonus of the same relative magnitude today would be in the neighborhood of $1,000. Masters also rewarded slaves who performed well with patches of land ranging up to a few acres for each family. Slaves grew marketable crops on these lands, the proceeds of which accrued to them. On the Texas plantation of Julian Devereux, slaves operating such land produced as much as 2 bales of cotton per patch. Devereux marketed their crop along with his own. In a good year, some of the slaves earned in excess of $100 per annum for their families. Devereux set up accounts to which he credited the proceeds of the sales. Slaves drew on these accounts when they wanted cash or when they wanted Devereaux to purchase clothing, pots, pans, tobacco, or similar goods for them. Occasionally, planters even devised elaborate schemes for profit sharing with their slaves. William Jemison, an Alabama planter, entered into the following agreement with his bondsmen. You shall have 2/3 of the corn and cotton made on the plantation, and as much of the wheat as will reward you for the sowing it. I also furnish you with provisions for this year. When your crop is gathered, 1/3 is to be set aside for me. You are then to pay your overseer his part, and pay me what I furnish, clothe yourselves, pay your own taxes and doctor's fee, with all the expenses of the farm. You are to be no expense to me, but render to me 1/3 of the produce, and what I have loaned you. You have the use of the stock and plantation tools. You are to return them as good as they are, and the plantation to be kept in good repair, and what clear money you make shall be divided equally amongst you, in a fair proportion agreeable to the services rendered by each hand. There will be an account of all lost time kept, and those that earn most shall have most. There was a third category of rewards. These were of a long-term nature, often requiring the lapse of a decade or more before they paid off. Thus, slaves had the opportunity to rise within the social and economic hierarchy that existed under bondage. Field hands could become artisans or drivers. Artisans could be allowed to move from the plantation to town, where they would hire themselves out. Drivers could move up the position to head driver or overseer. Climbing the economic ladder brought not only social status, but sometimes more freedom. It also had significant payoffs in better housing, better clothing, and cash bonuses. Little attention has hitherto been paid to the manner in which planters selected the slaves who were to become the artisans and managers. In some cases, boys were apprenticed to carpenters, blacksmiths, or some similar craftsmen when they were in their early teens, as was typically done with whites. For slaves, this appears to have been the exception rather than the rule. Analysis of occupational data derived from probate and plantation records reveals an unusual distribution of ages among slave artisans. Slaves in their 20s were substantially underrepresented, while slaves in their 40s and 50s were overrepresented. This age pattern suggests that the selection of slaves for training in the crafts was frequently delayed until slaves reached their late 20s, or perhaps even into their 30s. Normally, this would be an uneconomical policy, since the earlier an investment is made in occupational training, the more years there are to reap the returns on that investment. Slavery altered this pattern by shifting the authority to determine occupational investments from the parents to the masters. In free societies, kinship is usually the primary basis for determining which members of the new generation are trained in skilled occupations. But the slaveholder lacked the vested interests of a parent. He could, therefore, treat entry into the skilled occupations as a prize that was to be claimed by the most deserving, regardless of family background. The extra effort put forth by young field hands who competed for these jobs appears to have more than offset the loss in returns due to the curtailed period over which the occupational investment was amortized. We do not mean to suggest that kinship played no role in the intergenerational transfer of skills among slaves. We merely wish to stress that its role was significantly reduced as compared with free society. Another long-run reward was freedom through manumission. The chance of achieving this reward was, of course, quite low. Census data indicate that in 1850 the manumission rate was just 0.45 per 1,000 slaves. Manumission could be achieved either through the philanthropy of a master or through an agreement which permitted a slave to buy himself out. Sometimes gifts of freedom were bestowed while the master was still alive. More often, it was a bequest set forth in a will. Self-purchase involved arrangements under which slaves were permitted to purchase themselves with money that they had earned from work on their own account, or in the case of skilled urban slaves, by increasing the share of income which the artisan paid to his master. Some skilled slaves were able to accumulate enough capital to purchase their freedom within a decade. For others, the period extended to 2 decades or more. Little information is currently available on the prices at which such transactions were concluded. It is not known whether slaves involved in self-purchase were generally forced to pay a price in excess of their market value. From the foregoing, it is clear that slaves did not all live at a uniform level of income. The elaborate system of rewards erected by planters introduced substantial variation in the slave standard of living. Much work remains to be done before it will be possible to reconstruct with reasonable accuracy the full range of the slave income distribution. It has been possible, however, to estimate the basic income of slaves in 1850. This, together with some fragmentary evidence on the higher income of slaves, will at least suggest the range of income variation that prevailed. By basic income, we mean the value of the food, clothing, shelter, and medical care furnished to slaves. The average value of the expenditure on these items for an adult male in 1850 was about $48. The most complete information on the extra earnings of field hands comes from several Texas plantations. The leading hands on these estates frequently earned between $40 and $110 per year above basic income through the sale of cotton and other products raised on their patches. This experience was not unique to Texas. On one Alabama plantation, 8 hands produced cotton that earned them an average of $71 each, with the high man collecting $96. On still another plantation, the average extra earnings of the 13 top hands was $77. These scattered cases suggest that the ratio of high earnings to basic earnings among field hands was in the neighborhood of 2.5. When the incomes of artisans are taken into account, the spread in slave earnings become still wider. The top incomes earned by craftsmen must have been several times basic income. This is implied by the high prices which artisans had to pay to buy themselves out. The average price of a prime-aged blacksmith was about $1,700 in 1850. Thus, a 30-year-old man who was able to buy himself out in a decade probably earned in the neighborhood of $170 per year over subsistence. This suggests a ratio of artisan to basic income of about 4.5. The highest annual figure we have been able to uncover for extra earnings by a field hand in a single year is $309. Aham, the Alabama slave whose sales of peaches, apples, and cotton yielded this sum, had accumulated enough capital over the years so that in 1860 he held notes on loans totaling over $2,400. The ratio of Aham's agricultural income to basic income is 7.4. If we assume that Aham earned 6% or $144 on the loans, the ratio would rise to 10.4. The highest income above maintenance that we have found for an artisan is $500. In this case, the ratio of earned to basic income is 11.4. While the reward structure created much more room for upward mobility within the slave system than is usually supposed, the scope of opportunity should not be exaggerated. The highest levels of attainment were irrevocably foreclosed to slaves. The entrepreneurial talent obviously possessed by bondsmen such as Aham could not be used to catapult them into the stewardship of great businesses as long as they remained slaves. No slave, regardless of his gifts, could aspire to political position. No man of letters, there were slaves who acquired considerable erudition, could ever hold an appointment in the faculty of a Southern university as long as he was a bondsman. The entrepreneurial genius had to settle for lingering in the shadow of the master, on whose protection he was dependent. The man of letters could go no further than the position of tutor to the children of a benevolent and enlightened planter. It was on the talented, the upper crust of slave society, that deprivations of the peculiar institution hung most heavy. This perhaps explains why it was that the first to flee to northern lines as Yankee advances corroded the rebel positions were not the ordinary field hands, but the drivers and the artisans. As previously noted, a part of the income that slaves produced was expropriated from them. Determination of the average annual amount of this expropriation over the life cycle of the entire slave population is an extremely complex matter, for the rate of expropriation differed from slave to slave as well as from year to year for particular slaves. The issues involved in the computation and the procedures employed are discussed in Appendix B. The results of the computation are displayed in Figure 41. This figure presents the average accumulated value, or, in the language of economists, the expected present value of the income that was expropriated at each age of the life cycle. Prior to age 26, the accumulated expenditures by planters on slaves were greater than the average accumulated income which they took from them. After that age, the reverse was true. Planters broke even early in the 27th year. Over the balance of the life cycle, the accumulated or present value of the expropriation mounted, on average, to a total of $32. This last figure is 12% of the average present value of the income earned by slaves over their lifetimes. In other words, on average, 12% of the value of the income produced by slaves was expropriated by their masters. The relatively late age at which planters broke even is of great significance and requires further discussion. Two factors are responsible for this lateness. The first is that the cost of capital was high in the South, and planters had to advance capital to cover the expense of rearing slaves for many years before they received a return from the labor of slaves. Second, because of the high mortality rates which prevailed for both white and black in the antebellum era, less than half the slaves lived to the break-even age. Fully 40% of the slaves died before age 19. Thus, a substantial part of the income taken from these slaves, who survived into the later years, was not an act of expropriation, but a payment required to cover the expenses of rearing children who failed to reach later ages. An additional part of the income taken from productive slaves, much smaller than that taken to cover child rearing, was used to sustain unproductive elderly slaves, as well as the incapacitated in all ages. These intergenerational transfers of income were not, of course, limited to slave society. They took place among free men as well, for freemen must also bear the cost of rearing the young, including those who fail to survive, as well as of supporting the sick and the aged. But among freemen, the decision regarding the pattern of intergenerational transfers is made by parents rather than masters. The question thus arises, how did masters alter the pattern of intergenerational transfers as compared to what it would have been if slaves had been free? It is much easier to pose the question than to provide an answer. We do not yet have an answer to this question. We would, however, caution against two assumptions. It is not necessarily true that the substitution of planters for parents as decision-makers on this issue had a large effect on the pattern of intergenerational transfers. Nor is it necessarily true that readers would consider all changes in the pattern of transfers made by the planters to have been negative. For example, planters spent more, a larger share of earnings, on the medical care of slave children than did the parents of freedmen during the decades following the Civil War. The high break-even age also helps explain why United States planters encouraged the fertility of slave women, while slave owners in other parts of the hemisphere appear to have discouraged it. The crux of the matter is that child rearing was profitable only if the expected life of slaves at birth was greater than the break-even age. In the United States, the life expectation of slaves exceeded the break-even age by more than a half-decade. But in colonies such as Jamaica, available evidence suggests that life expectation fell below the break-even age, probably by at least a half-decade. Consequently, during most of the 18th century, masters in colonies such as Jamaica discouraged family formation and high fertility rates, preferring to buy adult slaves in Africa rather than to rear them. It was general policy to maintain an imbalance between the sexes, with men outnumbering women by a ratio of 4 to 3. To further reduce the basis for stable families, planters encouraged polygamy among slaves by rewarding favored men with second and third wives. Thus, for the remainder of the population, the male-female ratio was about 13 to 8. So large a disproportion between the sexes was bound to encourage sexual activity outside of the family and to reduce fertility. The care given to infants was quite poor compared with the South. Mothers were not encouraged to nurse their children. The Southern practice of a 40 to 50% reduction of the workload of nursing mothers was not imitated in Jamaica. Further evidence of the neglect of pregnant women is to be found in the high rate of stillbirths. On one of the leading Jamaica plantations, 75 out of 345 births over a 4-year period were stillborn. It has also been charged that abortion was both encouraged and widely practiced. The 12% rate of expropriation reported on slave income falls well within the modern tax rate on workers. It has been estimated that about 30% of the income of workers at the poverty level is taken from them through sales, real estate, and income taxes. On the other hand, such workers on average receive payments and various services from the government which more than offset the tax burden. Were there any services received by slaves which offset the income expropriated from them? The answer is yes, but they cannot be quantified reliably at present. Slaves shared in the benefits of large-scale purchases made by the planter. Their clothing, for example, would have been more costly if purchased individually. Perhaps an even more important benefit was the saving on interest charges. Through the intervention of their masters, slaves, in effect, were able to borrow at prime rates. Given the high interest charges which black sharecroppers suffered in the post-Civil War era and the debt peonage which enmeshed so many of them, the level of interest rates is not a small issue. Pending a more precise measurement of offsetting services, it seems warranted to place the average net rate of the expropriation of slave income at about 10%. Expropriation is not, however, the only form of exploitation. As is shown in Chapter 6, the economic burden imposed on slaves by other forms of exploitation probably exceeded that due to expropriation by a considerable margin.